Hi, I'm Ashton. It is like 9 in the morning. I've made myself a coffee, and I'm here to talk about a book, which is something that I haven't done before. To be fair, I've talked about like the Communist Manifesto, but I haven't done like a book review. And today, I'm going to be talking about Before I Had the Words, which is a book by Skyler Kergil. You may know him on YouTube as Skyler11. He doesn't make videos all that much anymore, but he does a lot of activism work, and he's a singer-songwriter, and he's an author. Fancy that. So I recently finished this book, and I wrote down a few things about it that I kind of wanted to talk about in, I guess, book review style. This isn't like a book report, you know. I'm not back to school yet. But I did think it was definitely one of the better trans-related books that I've read, and I wanted to give kind of my insight on it as a trans person and as a non-binary trans person that maybe doesn't have the same experiences as a lot of binary trans guys do. I've read quite a few trans-related books, but this is the first one that I'm doing a review on, so if you have any trans-related book recommendations, then please let me know, because I kind of want to make this a little series. I'm going to read Parrotfish soon. That's the next one that I have, but after that, I think that's all the trans-related books, but also I have, non-trans-related books, so I don't want to read about trans stuff all the time. But yeah, let's talk about this book, and let's talk about what I thought about it. Overall, I really, really enjoyed this book. There are a few things that I didn't like so much, or that made me uncomfortable, or that I thought could have been done better. So I am going to touch on those things, but don't take that as me, hating Skyler or anything. I do think that overall it is very well done and one of the better representations of trans people out there. First I wanted to go over the positive things. So immediately the first thing that I absolutely loved was the fact that he put in a bunch of disclaimers at the beginning. Like, he's got these 2 pages of disclaimer and then another half page, and I really, really loved these because, for me, I didn't need these, but for a cis person reading this book, there are a few things that they might take away that Skyler didn't want, so he put at the beginning, a few things that I really liked are, there's no one way to be transgender, and he also talked about how he's open about his experiences coming out, and he's open about his birth name, and he's open about surgery, but he makes sure that the reader knows that not every trans person is, and I think that's really, really important. He also states that even though he identifies as transgender, he also doesn't hold a free pass to ask any trans person invasive questions, which I liked. He kind of puts himself on the same level as the reader, saying, these things can be seen as invasive, and unless you know it's okay to ask somebody, you shouldn't. So I like that he puts out there that even though he's being open about this stuff, not every trans person necessarily is, or needs to be, or wants to be. He makes that seem okay, which is really good. He also mentions non-binary people in his disclaimer. He states that he's a binary trans man, but he has non-binary friends. He says that it's important to appreciate and celebrate and remind others that many transgender people do not experience binary transition. Thank you, Skyler. I love that, I appreciate that, and I think that's another super important thing to kind of say for cis people, like, hey, just because I'm binary doesn't mean every trans person is. He really puts this in a way that he's saying, my experience is valid, but that doesn't invalidate the experiences of every other trans person, He also says in that disclaimer, gender also doesn't really exist as it's a social construct. Good shit. So yeah, I really liked the humility in all of the disclaimers and making sure that any cisgender reader knows that, like, his experience isn't every experience, and that all trans people are different, and that not all trans people are open about this type of thing. So I would give that whole conversation 2 thumbs up. I thought it was a really mature and humble way to start a book, kind of telling people like, hey, I'm going to talk about this, but here are all the things that you should know first. A couple of reviews that I've seen on the book said that they didn't like it because of the style of telling the story, which I completely disagree with, but that is like kind of a more personal thing. Skyler tells this story in a series of little anecdotes, like he'll tell something from when he was a child, and then he'll jump to top surgery, and then we'll jump back to his teenage years. And some people in like Goodreads reviews said they found that slightly confusing. I didn't. Memoirs are one of my favorite styles of books, and I thought that this one was done really, really well. They don't always have to be chronological to make sense, and Skyler definitely demonstrates that. The way that he writes with anecdotes really weaves them together. It doesn't make it seem like a jagged storyline where you can't piece together the different stories. I didn't find it difficult to create a timeline within all of the little anecdotes, and it doesn't jump around in a way that makes it unreadable or hard to follow. Another thing I liked is that he included not just trans aspects of his life, and I really liked that because it humanizes being trans. It makes sure that the reader knows that being trans isn't the only thing by any means about Skyler's life. He talks about music, his family, friends, being rejected, school, college, homework, stress, addiction. And I really loved that because it felt like he was opening up about his life in a way that is everything, not just being trans, because as most trans people know, being trans isn't the entirety of your life, but a lot of cis people seem to think it is. So I felt like including stuff from, every aspect of his life made it a good read for cis people as well as trans people, simply for the reason that it doesn't purely focus on being trans. It is about being trans, that's what the book is about, but it doesn't feel that way. You do feel invested in things other than his transness, which I think is a really cool way to write. Jumping off of that, the way that he included all aspects of his life also really humanized the experience of being trans, which is something that Chase Ross said about this book as well. He has a little review thing on the back cover here, but I would totally agree with that. I've noticed that a lot of trans-related books, or even trans-related articles written by cis people, often make it all about being trans and surgery and hormones and pronouns and dysphoria. But Skyler didn't, and while he did include those things, he included so many different struggles that he's been through and so many different experiences and relationships. And, like I talked about earlier, it's not just about being trans. It's about growing up and maturity and all sorts of things. And I feel like that's a really good way to portray being trans just as a part of somebody's life, not their whole life. I also liked the way that he humanized the medical aspects. When he talked about going through surgery and starting testosterone, he didn't make it as medical as a lot of cis people would. He made it emotional and about his feelings and about what he experienced, and not necessarily like the cisgender view of it being so medical, which again, I really liked. I don't entirely know how to word this, but it feels like he humanized his story better than a cis person could have, if that makes sense. Not to generalize, but I do think cis people have a tendency to make medical aspects of being trans less human, whereas Skyler described it in a way that it connected it to him and it connected it to his personality and his emotions, and it felt more human and it felt more realistic for me, and I'm sure for a lot of trans people. So yeah, 2 thumbs up on that as well. I also really, really love that he talked about gatekeeping. He had a chapter where he talked about bottom dysphoria and the fact that it's not something that bothers him all that much, which I really appreciated as a trans person in general, because, there has been a lot of talk recently about, do you need dysphoria to be trans? Which I've done a video on that. It's not the best video, actually. I'd like to remake it, but, And he talks about how even he, a binary trans man, has been called out by other trans people for saying he's not trans enough because he doesn't want bottom surgery and because he doesn't have a shit ton of dysphoria around his genitals. And I really, really love that that was represented in a tangible way where I could feel like, hey, me too. I don't want bottom surgery either, but I'm still trans and I'm still trans enough. And that's good, and that's okay. That's another way that he humanized being trans and showed that not every trans person is the same. And even when explaining that he didn't have that dysphoria, he explained that some people do, and that's okay as well. So even though he talked about his own experiences with it, I feel like he included everybody in a way that, hey, this is just me, this isn't necessarily everybody, and everybody has a different experience, which I, again, really loved. He kind of broke down gatekeeping in many different ways, both with the disclaimers and with saying, you don't need intense bottom dysphoria, you don't need to hate your body to be trans. So, another 2 thumbs up. What is that, 6 thumbs now? I don't know. Another thing that I liked is, as a trans person, you experience transphobia on the daily, but whenever he did, and it was a new counter-argument or idea that it was transphobic, he would often put in a footnote about this is why this idea is wrong, or this is how you can argue back against this, which I thought was also really cool because oftentimes when addressing transphobic things, we just complain about them and we don't necessarily explain why that's bad or why that's wrong. But he did in a way that I feel is accessible to cisgender people, and I really liked that. Let me try to find a footnote for you guys. The first time he wrote about a dead name, he put a footnote saying, "Dead name is one phrase some use to describe their given name at birth." And of course, I don't know if Skyler did that or if that was a publisher decision, knowing that cis people could read the book and not know what the fuck Skyler's talking about. But whoever made that decision, I did think it was really good, because even if I don't need those footnotes, a lot of people reading the book might. I do think that he did write the footnotes, though, because sometimes they're to explain childhood nicknames and why he was called that. Which is adorable, and it makes the footnotes seem less like you're reading an essay, and more like this is a memoir. Which it is, so this doesn't really have to do with the footnotes, but a lot of times he'll also say I'm still learning, which I also love. I think even within the first chapter he said that. I'm in that mindset as well, that there's always more to learn and there's always, more ways that you can stand up for people that are like you or aren't like you. And I feel like the fact that he recognized that in his book about his life, where, many people try to make it seem complete or seem like they do know everything, Skyler still keeps it open to be like, hey, I might make mistakes and that's okay. And I thought that was a really healthy mindset, especially for an activist to have, because keeping your mind open to still making mistakes and still correcting yourself and learning is super duper good. Another thing I really liked is the resources that he put in the back. So what I've seen in many other books about being trans is that the author, trans or not, will put a bunch of websites, call centers, stuff like that in the back that can help people questioning their gender or their sexuality or anything like that. But what Skyler did instead was he put a link to a website. And this website is, that resource page, but it's constantly being updated and he's constantly adding things when he learns things like he was talking about. And I thought that was really, really great. Because you don't have to buy the book to access it, it's just a page of resources online, which is possibly more accessible than a paperback book. So I thought that was a really good idea. It allows him to change and adapt the sources that he gives out without having to republish the book every month, So I really loved that aspect of it too. I haven't seen it done that way before. I don't know if that's a common thing, but I really loved that. Now, one thing that I didn't like was the use of the T slur, unfortunately. He never, used it in a derogatory way. He just gave examples of how it was used against him, which I understand. I've been called the T slur, but it didn't have a footnote. And I don't think he ever referred to it as a slur. He just used that word in other people's quotes, which I do understand. I get that. And I get that he's been called that. I have too. I know the feeling. But I really would have appreciated a footnote or even a paragraph on how, I was called this word, but hey, keep in mind that this word is a slur and you probably shouldn't use it if you're cisgender or talking to a trans person, maybe don't. So I thought you could have been a bit more responsible about that. I get that, again, that could have been a publisher decision, but I think that would have been good to kind of at least mention that, this word that I've just been called, you shouldn't use. I don't have the time, currently to flip all the way through this book and find when he uses the T slur, but I think it was twice-ish. If I'm wrong, and he did say something about, it being a slur or talking about how it shouldn't be used, then please correct me and point me to that page or something. But from what I remember reading this, a few days ago, a week ago, he didn't do that. So just keep that in mind. One thing that I personally was uncomfortable with was the talk about long-distance relationships. And this is just about me. This isn't Skyler's fault. It's totally fine. As you guys know, I have a boyfriend. His name is Jack. We've been together for 2 years and 3 months-ish. I mean, we're not like an adult couple that's been married 30 years, but for a 17 and an 18-year-old, we've been in a relationship for a long time. And he's going off to college in about a week after this video goes up. And it's not something I've really talked about online all that much, but you guys know Jack. He's in videos a lot, and he probably won't be in videos as often because he'll be 3 hours away from me. And we're not separating. We're gonna try to make it work. It is a college that I'm looking into when I go to college next year. But anyways, how that relates to the book is Skyler was in a couple long-distance relationships, and neither of them lasted, and both of them kind of ended with I don't believe in long-distance relationships, and I was like, oh, fuck. He was also in a college course where the professor was like, how many of you are in long-distance relationships? And, people raised their hands, including him, and then the professor was like, well, statistically, it's probably not going to last, so we'll see at the end of the semester. And I was like, huh. So that worried me a bit. But again, that's my own insecurities. And something that I just noticed. I'm not bashing Skyler for that. It's totally fine. He can think whatever he wants about long-distance relationships. But I did like how he compared it to another relationship he had where somebody broke up with him because he was trans. She was supportive at first, but eventually she was like, well, I believe that being transgender is a mental disorder and you're never gonna be happy. And that broke my heart. That absolutely broke my heart. I love that he shared that, and I love that he talked about that experience and kind of dismantled why that's not true and how he is happy being trans. But at first reading that, it really tore at my heartstrings, because that's something that I'm pretty insecure about in relationships. And I trust Jack, and I know he doesn't think that, but this was a fairly long relationship that he'd been in, and this girl just changed her mind and said, I can't date you because you're trans. And I was just like, whew. But those two things have more to do with my own insecurities, and I think it's cool that Skyler shared those things, because even though it did, like, kind of make my heart race, I was like, I'm not alone, and I'm not the only one that has these worries or has these experiences, and I really loved that he shared that, and it was something that I could relate to. Another thing that I kind of wanted to touch on was that he continuously used trans woman as one word, where all the times I noticed he said trans man as two words, and I'm not entirely sure why. This was published in 2017, so I'm not sure why they did use trans woman as one word when, from what I know at least, it is supposed to be two, just like trans man is. For those of you that don't know why, trans is a descriptor word that describes somebody's gender, just like cisgender is. It explains, like, what type of gender it is. So you can be a cisgender woman or a transgender woman. Both are women. But trans woman being one word kind of excludes them sometimes, and I've seen a lot of trans women being uncomfortable with being called, like, trans woman in one word. So again, I don't know if that was a publisher decision or his writing itself, but I didn't notice a footnote on that either, and it kind of made me uncomfortable, like, why would you make that one word when trans man is two? And he was pretty clear that trans is a descriptor for gender, and he talked about how you shouldn't call people transgenders, stuff like that, because it's grammatically incorrect. I'm 99% sure that applies to trans woman being two words. So I don't know why that was there. I wouldn't be surprised if it did make some trans women uncomfortable if they read this book. It's not like the worst thing he could have done, but I would like to see him talk about that, and maybe he has, and maybe I missed it or whatever, so please direct me towards that if he's talked about that. But yeah, that did make me a little bit kind of wary. I was like, oh, okay. But aside from those few things, I did really, really love this book. It's probably one of my favorite memoir autobiography style books that I've read. But anyways, I do want to review Laura Jane Grace's Skyler book, which I've read twice already, but I'm going to reread so that I can, like, mark some pages and talk about some shit, because I feel like that book is a very, very unique one. I don't see a lot of memoirs written by trans women, but that could also be because I am transmasculine, and that's more of what I see for whatever reason. But yeah, overall, I would recommend this book. I'd give it like a 9 out of 10. It dismantles a lot of things that cis people might think about trans people that aren't true. It really humanizes being trans, and I think that it's a really good read. And if you are transgender, whether you're binary, non-binary, trans-feminine, trans-masculine, I think that you will see a little bit of yourself in this book, no matter who you are. He's very inclusive and very open-minded, and I overall really enjoyed the way that it was written. So that's my review of this book. Let me know if you do want me to review Laura Jane Grace's Skyler book. I also have Alex Birdie's Transmission book, which I have already read but would want to reread for a review. So yeah, let me know if you like this book video type thing. It's a new thing that I want to do. But I enjoyed it. I like talking about books, and I like being trans, so here we are. Goodbye. I hope that you read a good book today and see yourself represented somewhere, and I will talk to you later, maybe.